So welcome everyone to Mongabay's webinar for journalists and anyone who's interested in learning more about big environmental topics in the news. So as with past webinars, you're going to be able to view this one on our YouTube channel. So be sure to find our channel and then click subscribe. So today's webinar is focused on carbon markets, carbon credits, and offsets. As companies increasingly invest in carbon markets and offset projects to fulfill their carbon neutrality or carbon negative commitments, many questions arise around the efficacy and transparency of these projects or lack thereof. And so we're going to discuss all of that, and most importantly, how to cover these issues and tackling the most important implications. So as always, we'll have 10 to 15 minutes at the end of this hour-long webinar to share resources, story ideas, and answer any questions that you're all going to have. But I'm going to start first with introducing our panel. So I'd first like to start by introducing Frances Seymour. Frances is a distinguished senior fellow at the World Resources Institute, where she conducts research and writes about forest and climate issues, including the role of forest carbon credits in carbon markets. She also serves as an advisor to the Climate Land Use Alliance and chairs the board of the Architecture for REDD+ transactions and chairs the Oslo Tropical Forest Forum. Frances, thank you for joining us. Next, we have Rachel Donald. Rachel is an independent investigative journalist exposing climate corruption around the world. She is also producer of Radio Free Sarawak and creator of Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis, interviewing world experts from the front lines of the climate crisis. Rachel, thanks so much for joining us. And lastly, we have Joe Eisen. He is the executive director of Rainforest Foundation UK, where he has worked for over a decade in defense of community rights in tropical forests. Prior to joining RFUK, Joe studied social anthropology at the London School of Economics and worked on social justice campaigns and projects with several grassroots indigenous environmental and developmental NGOs in Guyana, Gabon, and India. Before taking the helm at RFUK, Joe headed up the organization's research and policy team, leading its work on REDD+ and sustainable conservation. Joe, many thanks for being here. And I'm your host and moderator, Mike DiGirolamo, Audience Engagement Associate for Mongabay.com, where we regularly cover carbon offset projects. So if you want to do paid reporting for us on this topic after today's discussion, visit the opportunity section at our nonprofit sister site, which is mongabay.org. Scroll down and click on carbon offsets. We're going to cover 10 central questions today, and I'll give each panelist a couple of minutes to answer each one. And towards the end of the hour, we're going to get to your questions. So please note again that this webinar is recorded and it will be published to our YouTube channel for your reference, along with the links and any resources that are shared in the chat. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. And let's start by defining our terms. What are carbon credits and how are these distinct from carbon offsets?
Okay, I guess that's me. And first of all, Mike, thanks so much for hosting this webinar. I'm a huge fan of Mongabay, and I think this is going to be a really useful discussion. So I think this is a great question to start out with, because I think the confusion between the term carbon credit and carbon offset is the basis of a lot of people talking past each other in this space. And for me, a carbon credit is a unit. I mean, it's a noun. It's used to delineate a fixed amount of carbon emissions reductions or removals so that we can have a currency of transactions in carbon. But carbon offsetting, for me, it's a verb. It's when credits are used for one particular purpose to either, counteract or counterbalance for emissions in another place. So offsetting is one possible use of a carbon credit, but credits can also be financed and counted towards an NDC. Carbon credits can be purchased and immediately retired and not used for offsetting or to make any kinds of claims. So they're really, they're related, but they're not the same thing. And I guess another important distinction that I want to raise in this context is that for most people, when you say the word offset, the implication is that a credit is being used to substitute for reducing emissions that really ought to be reduced anyway, say in the context of a company's decarbonization. But a company could also use a carbon credit to compensate for the remaining unabated emissions, even if they're decarbonizing like crazy on their way to net zero as fast as they can. So, in my view, I might feel differently about those two different uses of offsetting. So it's really not only important to differentiate between a carbon credit and offsetting, but also offsetting an emission reduction that should be reduced anyway, or offsetting in addition to a science-aligned decarbonization pathway.
Thank you very much for having me, Mongabay, Mike, as well. It's really great to be here. Francis, that was an excellent introduction into the terms. And I don't really want to repeat what you've just said because you explained it so well. I think what I would say is that, I mean, ultimately, these terms do reveal a financialization of the climate crisis and a financialization of the opportunities to save the planet from greenhouse gas emissions and from global warming. So whilst carbon credits are essentially, it's a term for buying currently an unregulated amount of carbon from forests around the world. And carbon offsetting is exactly as Francis says, which is essentially, it's synonymous with pollution, really, in my opinion. And so then that kind of leads us to net zero as well. Like, this is ultimately, I would say it is the market doing its best to respond to the problem in a way that encourages people around the world to perhaps get on board or perhaps to make a profit off of it by couching the issue in financial and market terms, which is why we're also seeing, you know, race to net zero and all of that. That's kind of what I would like to say on it.
Joe, do you have anything to add? Okay, so then let's go ahead and talk about markets, because obviously that's what we're here to discuss. So what are carbon markets and what is the difference between them? Specifically, what's the difference between a compliance market or a voluntary carbon market? And Francis, you go ahead and start us off with that one.
Okay, I'll take a first pass. So, you know, carbon markets are a way for providing a mechanism to reduce more emissions at the same cost, or the same, produce more emission reductions at the same cost, or the same level of reductions at a lower cost by incentivizing companies or other entities to finance emission reductions. And traditionally, by financing emission reductions, by driving money to the least cost emissions reduction first, and then gradually working your way up on the marginal abatement cost curve. But there are different models of how to do this. For example, in Colombia, companies can avoid paying carbon taxes by purchasing carbon credits instead. So there's lots of different models. In general, in a compliance market, the emissions reductions are an obligation imposed through government regulation on companies. And so overall emissions are capped and companies are allocated a certain portion of the total emissions allowed in a given period. And then companies are allowed to meet some portion of that emission reduction obligation through offsetting. In other words, purchasing credits in order to compensate for emissions that they have not been able to reduce. And an example of a compliance market close to home here in the United States is the one that California, the state of California, has developed as its cap and trade system, which has a compliance obligation of which a small percentage can be met through offsetting. A voluntary carbon market, by contrast, is exactly what it sounds like it is. It's voluntary. And companies or other entities can purchase carbon credits because they think it's a good thing to do, or because they want to make a claim for their brand or a particular project. For example, if they want to market a carbon neutral candy bar or host a carbon neutral event, to purchase carbon credits to compensate for the emissions associated with that, that candy bar or that event. But of course, one of the main challenges to the voluntary carbon market is that it remains largely unregulated.
Yeah, on that, I would like to say for any journalists who are listening and who do want to sort of get into reporting on these, in the parts of the world where we are still blessed with forests, despite huge deforestation, it is the voluntary carbon market that is now targeting these vulnerable nations and peoples. So Southeast Asia, the Pacific, the unregulated nature of that market, meaning that prices can be set at whatever, and typically, you know, politicians and companies can work in tandem in the way that they have with loggers for decades, can sort of reap the profits from this market. And typically the money is not, I might be skipping ahead a few questions here, Mike, but typically the money is not going back to people. So for anyone who is interested in looking into carbon markets, I would highly suggest you investigate the voluntary market off the bat.
Yes, yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I would say that until fairly recently, the compliance markets have dwarfed the voluntary ones. That's starting to change. As Rachel mentioned earlier, with the onset of different net zero commitments, so we're going to see a huge growth in the voluntary carbon markets over the coming years, and from our perspective, that various risks. But for want of not getting ahead of myself, I'll leave it there for now.
All right, so that then raises the question then, is there an ideal market to achieve these climate mitigation goals? And inherent in this is the concept of additionality. So if you all want to speak to what additionality means and how one evaluates whether, greenhouse gas emissions are additional, feel free to speak to that in this question as well.
Okay. Well, is there an ideal market? There's, of course, a huge debate about the relative roles and positives and negatives associated with pure government regulation models, carbon pricing models, mostly expressed through carbon taxes, as opposed to markets. And there are hybrids, among those. And so a lot comes down to the design features that make them more or less effective. And as again, we know in the different countries where we live, some of those are more politically viable than others. And so some of the market, mechanisms may be second best to other ways to attack climate change, but it may be the only one that's politically feasible. At World Resources Institute, we've been spending a lot of time internally discussing about how voluntary carbon markets, and especially demand for so-called nature-based solutions, which include forests, can work to achieve mitigation goals in ways that serve the interests both of the goal of protecting the climate, but also for achieving other sustainable development goals related to justice, rights, conservation of biodiversity, and lots of other benefits. And we have come up with a set of guardrails to deal with this additionality issue, Mike, that you raised on both the supply side and the demand side, because an ideal market would make sure that on the supply side, any emissions reductions and removals are real and additional in the sense that they wouldn't have happened anyway. They are a net increment, from the perspective of the atmosphere in terms of emissions being generated or carbon being pulled out. And also that they're produced in a way that not only does no harm to local ecosystems or indigenous and local communities, but leaves them better off than they would otherwise have been, but also empowers them to be, exercise agency in the design of the programs that reduce those emissions in the first place. But there's also environmental and social integrity on the demand side, and that's where we want to make sure that companies purchasing these credits aren't just doing so as a get out of jail free card from not having to reduce their own emissions. And so in our position, reductions, any purchase of carbon credits by companies that are then used to make claims really have to be in addition to a science-aligned decarbonization pathway towards net zero, or else they're not, part of the solution. There are a lot of other issues related to ideal carbon markets, which have to do with the transparency of the transactions, so that we know where they're being sold for what claims are being made against them, and all that kind of thing. And there's a whole plethora of initiatives going on right now that I can speak to later that are trying to define some of those specifics.
Great, thank you, Frances.
I think the problem when discussing market is the incentive of the market. So if we continue with our current economic system, which is free market, and the incentive is profit, then no, I do not think that is the type of structure that could help mitigate climate change, because it is simply the other side of the coin of the economic structure that caused a huge part of the problem. It is the commodification of forests and timber, essentially, that saw huge deforestation, and it's created swaths of vulnerable indigenous people around the world who have had their lands taken away from them. And now essentially they're being told, well, we won't take your lands, but only if we can buy the carbon in it too. I mean, the forest, if you just left the forest alone without paying for it, you would have the same effect. So for me, my sort of concern long term is, well, if we do this for 10, 20 years, and then I don't know, the techno optimism, we come up with some sort of carbon capture solution and we don't need carbon credits anymore, then it's very likely that some other commodity in the forest would become the next thing on sort of the global economic system's chopping board, frankly. So I really, really do not think that the market can or should solve this problem, especially when we look at other industries and how the market is failing to solve those problems. So in terms of what Francis was saying about, accountability and transparency, it's transparency and accountability over a thing, a noun, a carbon credit. It doesn't exist. It's very much a concept. How can we expect to account for those credits transparently when, for example, in the fashion industry, we cannot even account for scope 3 emissions, because despite supply chains moving physical products from site A to Z, we cannot account for those because of the opaque nature of these institutions, again, because of the profit incentive. And finally, frankly, as long as we live in a world where we have tax havens and other opaque financial institutions, I do not expect us to be able to stay on top of this market as if we can on any other, and B, therefore for it to be built to provide the solution that it says it will.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Joe, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say from my perspective that market-based approaches in forests are particularly controversial because forests have overlapping land uses and rights and causes of deforestation. They're very complex environments versus other kinds of offset opportunities. So I think it's particularly difficult to apply market-based approaches in that kind of context. And it's notable that some of the world's biggest emitters, oil companies, for example, are the biggest advocate of market-based approaches to forests rather than regulatory ones. And we think there needs to be more of an accent on sort of regulatory approaches. There was some progress on that at COP26. Francis has a response.
Sure, Francis, go ahead.
Well, we're going to get into this later in the session when we discuss REDD+, but I don't think market-based approaches and regulatory approaches are alternatives. I mean, they're related to each other. I mean, one could incentivize a government to strengthen regulation by providing a financial reward for success in doing so. So just thought I would throw that in.
Go ahead, Rachel.
Yes, in an ideal world, but the locations of these forests, which are typically where the vast majority of carbon credits are stored, are run by, we know, governments that have histories of corruption, histories of deforestation, histories of land rights abuses. So to think that a market approach would incentivize any kind of consideration for climate change or for protection of these forests when these governments quite literally have never cared about their forests and never cared about their people. To me, it's facilitating that same problem, kind of what Joe's saying as well. Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and say that.
Okay. We can get back to this question a little bit later because we're actually going to be talking about some of these environmental implications and social implications and indigenous rights and human rights implications. But I want to talk about now what's the best way for journalists to talk about all these terms that we just discussed to a broader audience, because there's a lot of complexity and nuance behind them. What advice do you all have for journalists when talking about them?
I'm going to pass on that in the first instance because I'm not a journalist nor a professional communications person. So maybe others on the panel can start off.
No worries.
Well, I think you say the terms and then you explain them every time. Never assume that anyone knows what you're talking about. I think carbon credits are fairly self-explanatory. The minute you get into offsets, additionality, all this stuff. No, people need to know what these things mean, and they need to be explained. And I would say, this isn't quite a direct answer to this question, but I would say, given the nature of the urgency of the situation that we find ourselves in with the climate crisis, and as we will get into later, the urgency of the situation that Indigenous peoples find themselves in as well, I think journalists at this point in history should be using their voices quite stridently and unafraid, perhaps, to give their own opinions with their expert knowledge that they have on this topic.
Yeah, I think Rachel captures that pretty well from my perspective.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get to the next question. Perhaps you can speak to this one, Francis, as well. What are the biggest challenges that journalists face when covering these? What are some of the hurdles that people are going to have to jump through to be able to do the work to cover these complex issues?
Boy, we could talk about that for the rest of the afternoon. I think one of the issues is that the answer to most important questions is it depends, or compared to what. And so I'd say the most difficult challenge for a journalist, especially in a word limited or time limited piece, is providing enough of the context for the particular story being highlighted for the reader to be able to understand its significance. So I'm going to give a stylized example. There have been pieces that have spotlighted an issue in suggesting lack of integrity in certain kinds of carbon credits, but when you dig down into the data, it turns out that actually that lack of integrity only accounts for a few percent of an overall market, or an overall volume of credits sold. So that if you had that information, you as a reader might think, well, that's not that bad, because the other 97%, were real, emissions reductions. And so that's one example of a context. Another is, I'm sympathetic to Rachel's concerns about how capitalism can go wrong. I'm old enough to not think that we can replace capitalism in the 8 years we have left to end tropical deforestation. So we sort of need to engage the systems that we have. And she's absolutely right that capitalism has given us these problems in terms of markets for timber and other things that people want from the forests. But this one is different in that it's a market that incentivizes forest conservation. And so I think in this case, it's sort of like, well, compared to what, deforestation as usual, what are the alternatives? If you don't like, carbon credits, what is the alternative to achieve the stated objective? And I guess after my decades of being in this business of trying to end deforestation, we've tried a lot of different things, and, not a lot of them have worked. And this morning, my day started with the webinar releasing the Global Forest Watch 2021 tree cover loss numbers. And can we be clear? We have a 20-year track record now with satellite data behind it of losing between 3 and 4 million hectares of primary tropical forest every year. So, I think it's time to try all the tools in the toolbox. And of course, with apportioning the risks to people who can afford to take risks and not to the vulnerable. But I think the biggest risk of all is the risk of no action. So when journalists are covering these stories, that context of like, as one of my WRI colleagues put it, okay, wise guy, what's your idea? So it's that kind of context. Thanks.
Joe, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, Francis makes the very fair point that if it's not credits, then what is it? But we're going to talk about RED shortly, and RED has been in existence for 15 years, and there's been various attempts to try and create credible, high integrity carbon credits, and Francis is leading on the sort of latest initiative on that, which I'm sure we'll sort of get into a bit in a bit, a bit later. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the biggest challenges, yeah, I mean, because of the complexities around carbon accounting, a lot of these kinds of processes have become very convoluted, very complex, very multifaceted, right from the sort of ground where, sort of indigenous peoples through to the architecture, through to the sort of market aspects of them. So it's a very complex thing to kind of cover. And I guess that's the point of this webinar, to try and start cutting through these kinds of things. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the knowledge around carbon markets and RED exists in international institutions, and it's not always grounded in the realities of what's happening in tropical rainforest areas. So I think it's it's how you can cut through the PR, and there's a lot of it, and to sort of really cut through to see what's actually happening on the ground and what the political, what is the political economy of this.
I would completely agree with that. I think that for many journalists, it doesn't actually have to be that complicated a story, and to get bogged down in the accounting of it would kind of be to miss the point. Because I mean, so far in the past 6 months, we have seen indigenous peoples in Mexico be displaced from their land in order to make the forest available to be put on the carbon credit market. We saw the state of Sabah, this was exposed by Mongabay, signed up to a 100-year, $80 billion deal with no prior informed consent from the indigenous peoples, despite that being in the state law. In the past few months, in the past month, I have heard of 3 different carbon credit companies trying to muscle into the state of Oro in Papua New Guinea that have been set up very, very recently, with absolutely no history in carbon credit trading or any environmentalism. And even just this morning, in conjunction with the NGO Forest Southeast Asia, we published a list of 15 carbon credit companies, which are some of the leading worldwide, that are registered in offshore jurisdictions. So these are the stories. It is happening to people on the ground. Land is being lost. Money is going into people's pockets. Forests are being put in danger, quite frankly, by the fact that we do live in a world where there are folk who exist purely to take advantage of schemes. So you don't need to get bogged into down into the details of accounting. Go and get the stories of how this is affecting people on the ground and tell those stories. That's what I would say.
Joe, did you have anything to add there?
No, that's
okay.
That was fine.
So actually that you started to get into my next question here, Rachel. So with that said, what are some of those stories right now that journalists should be paying attention to? And I realize that we could probably talk about quite a few stories on this webinar. So what are some of the biggest ones where you think that this is an example where you think that journalists should be looking out for this in subsequent stories that they cover?
So, I mean, I do agree with Rachel that this is a space where, and we've seen this movie before 15 years ago, when carbon cowboys were first unleashed into the wild. And journalists very much have an important watchdog role to play in ensuring both demand side integrity and supply side integrity of carbon markets more generally, by exposing, those bad practices or bad actors when they occur. And so I certainly wouldn't discourage, that kind of on the ground reporting, as Rachel said, or, following the money and, just exposing where there is a gap between what practice is actually happening and the kinds of, high level guardrails that I articulated earlier. I would also say that this is a space where there's a lot of conflict of interest among the people and institutions involved. And, you may have thought that Joe read my bio too long with all my different affiliations, but I feel like it's really important for all of us in this space to disclose all the different ways we articulate with different entities that may have an interest. None of my interests are commercial in nature. I'm not making a lot of money doing this, but others may be. And so I think one job for journalists is to dig into a little bit about the various connections and interests and affiliations that people and organizations may have who are active in this space. Another story that was alluded to earlier has to do with all these new technologies or crediting methodologies that are suddenly, sprouting up all over the landscape. Some of which I think are, positive contributions to the field. Some of them are a little dodgy and maybe non-transparent. And so there's definitely some investigative reporting to be done on those to really unpack, how is this good for the climate or not? What assurances do we have that, that's going to be permanent or additional, as we talked about earlier? So there are a whole set of stories related to that. Having said that, lots of ways that journalists can play that watchdog role and exposing bad actors. I do think there's room for telling some good news stories about how markets have, in fact, been effective in reducing emissions or improving, providing incentives for restoration, and achieving other goals that we all share. And just the one example I would mention is the example of the Yurok tribe in Northern California, they have, decided to participate in California's cap and trade system with forest carbon credits, and have used the proceeds to really rehabilitate a lot of their cultural and natural heritage. And, that's the kind of story that I think gets lost in the, focus on, how many ways can REDD+ be bad for Indigenous peoples? Well, here's a case where, forest carbon crediting has been quite good for Native Americans. And I think we just need to be sure to report on those stories as well.
I think that some of the biggest stories right now are within the UN itself, within REDD itself, within Vera. So one of the things that we report on frequently at Sarawak Report, and I try and get into, with Mongabay as well, is the fact that most of these companies that are sort of termed exploitative after the fact, after deals have already been signed, they're all signed off on by Vera. This body, which works in conjunction with the UN, is signing off on deals that have been created by companies with no free prior informed consent from Indigenous peoples, by companies that didn't exist until a month before the deal was struck, that are led by people that either have no experience in environmentalism or used to work in oil and gas. So how is this happening? How is the world's leading body on verifying whether or not carbon credit deals are good for the peoples and the lands? How is this getting through? That needs investigating. I would say that generally REDD needs much more investigating than is being done. It is a deeply, I find, opaque process. Why are these markets not being regulated? Why is REDD not calling for more regulation? Yeah, I mean, how is so much of this sort of being allowed to happen? I think also there's a lot to look at in the oil and gas industry. So nature-based solutions is a term that came from Shell itself. And they have a whole department that is focused on the carbon credit trade. And right now they are meeting with different states in Malaysia to try and get involved in buying up their forests. And this is a company that was drilling in Malaysia not too long ago and is still continuing to. So there's a lot of big player action happening here. There's a lot of little stories to be written about carbon credit companies that really are just sort of taking advantage of the market. And if anyone listening, I really go to the Pacific Islands. It's all happening there. But also very important to keep an eye on the big players that are running the show, and keep on top of what they claim to be doing. Because, I mean, yes, we could pray and hope that the market will provide us solutions, but the market's had a lot of time actually to provide solutions, because the data on all of this has been out since the 1970s, 1980s, and we're still in this situation today. So I would like to see much, much more aggressive questioning of what is presented as solutions.
You all have mentioned REDD+, and one thing we want to, what is REDD+? We want to talk about that, and what should journalists be paying attention to when they're covering it?
Okay, great. Yeah, we've been talking a lot about it before having said what it is. Okay, so REDD Plus for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, and a whole nother sentence that talks about essentially enhancing removals by encouraging forests to grow back and be conserved and be well managed, is a framework for international cooperation towards that objective. That was negotiated under the UN FPIC. So there's something called the Warsaw Framework for REDD Plus, negotiations completed in 2013, and it was incorporated by reference into the Paris Agreement. And that's the reason that the only sector that has its own article in the Paris Agreement is the forestry sector. Article 5 talks essentially about REDD Plus. And the main unique feature of REDD Plus compared to the decades of international cooperation on conserving forests that came beforehand is the feature of payment for performance. Now, Rachel earlier expressed skepticism that forest-rich developing countries, the governments have any motivation to protect forests or whatever do so. But I think this unique feature of payment for performance is significant in that if you don't actually reduce the emissions or enhance removals, you don't get the money. It's post facto performance-based finance. So I think that is an important distinction to highlight. I think it's important to understand that REDD Plus is currently sort of bifurcated in terms of how it's been implemented over the last decade or so since the idea was first entered the negotiations. First has been donor-based finance for jurisdictional scale implementation. And by jurisdictional scale, I mean at the level of entire countries, REDD Plus programs, and in some cases, programs at the level of a large state or province, a subnational jurisdiction. And so the World Bank's Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, Carbon Fund, the Norwegian government, the German government have all provided finance for results-based payments at the jurisdictional scale. In parallel to that, and actually preceding that, there have been project-level forest carbon projects that also have gone under the banner of REDD Plus that have been almost exclusively financed through the voluntary carbon market. So we have these two sort of parallel universes of donor financed REDD Plus, which is really aligned with what was ultimately negotiated under the UNFCCC in terms of jurisdictional scale implementation. But then we also have all of these projects that have been ongoing and new ones being developed as we speak, mostly financed through the voluntary carbon market. And right now, we're at a very interesting inflection point with, I think, a lot of interesting reporting opportunities where, first of all, as has already been alluded to, we have this surge of interest in purchasing carbon credits of all kinds, but especially forest carbon credits, which in the voluntary market have seen the largest increase in volume and higher in value. Just at the moment when the first generation of jurisdictional scale credits available on the voluntary market are likely to emerge within the next year. This is where my affiliation with the Architecture for REDD Plus Transactions comes in, because this is a voluntary initiative that has created a market-oriented standard for accrediting these jurisdictional scale credits. And it attempts to deal with all of the issues that we've been talking about, whether it's making sure that the emissions reductions are additional, or making sure that Indigenous peoples rights are respected and have full participation in the process before those credits can be issued for sale on the market. So there are just a ton of stories, I think, to be reported on related to this transition from the bifurcated market to one where jurisdictional scale credits come on the market, which include all of the issues related to, are we seeing that the prospect of these funds is changing the behavior of governments? Are they making different decisions if they realize that there could be a new source of revenue for doing so? Are they paying more attention to talking to Indigenous and local communities because the standard says that they have to in order to get accredited to this standard? What prices are being negotiated? Is there a price premium for this kind of credit or that kind? what happens to the projects that are within those jurisdictions? Are they going to go off on their own and just be cut out, or are they going to nest into a common accounting system? And, is that fair? So there's just a zillion questions that are going to come out of the developments that we're likely to see over the next year.
Rachel, I want to go ahead and give you a chance to respond. Joe, I see you've joined. I'll give you a second to jump back in after Rachel speaks.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I mean, it demands what you just said, Francis, sort of demands ignoring other parts of the reality of the situation when it comes to these governments that we're discussing and their commitments to environmentalism. Malaysia, for example, lied on its recent report to the UN about its emissions, just barefaced lied. It also is a nation that has the habit, that in Papua New Guinea as well, of faking signatures of indigenous peoples. Or rounding up one, changing the law slightly so that signature is then weighted for the whole clan or for the whole tribe. Like this is the kind of level of corruption that we're dealing with. It's not the same. It might be the same market, but it's very different rules depending on the locality. And I think that's where journalism is so absolutely key, because we are not affiliated with any organization or any institution that may be creating these schemes or benefiting from these schemes or whatever. And that is why I think ultimately journalists play such an important role in providing an objective, unbiased narrative reporting on the situation. Mike, I don't know if you want me to move into the red thing, or do you want to give Joe a chance to respond now?
Let's go ahead and have you speak a little bit on that, and then I'll give Joe a chance.
So red, well, it's been around a while, as Francis said. How something has been around for 15 years, and yet still every month we are seeing projects being created, developed, and exposed for their either exploitative practices or the illegal nature of their deals, etc., etc. That makes me question the efficiency and the effectiveness of RED, or perhaps what it was set up for in the first place. It has an interesting history, if anybody wants to go and have a look. It has also been known to insert itself into political conversations where it was not invited. At COP26, there were more than a few rumors surrounding what RED and its people were sort of up to there. So allegedly. So what I would say is that it is definitely an institution that needs much more scrutiny. And I think that journalists around the world could all help. And at this point, I would like to say as well, for anybody listening that is an investigative journalist, write it for Mongabay. Mongabay are a fantastic publication for these kinds of stories and for platforming these kinds of stories.
Joe, thanks for your patience there. Go ahead and, reiterate on anything that you wanted to speak about before you cut out. We were just discussing Red Plus. And then Francis, I'll give you a chance to respond after that.
Okay, yeah, sorry about my technical issues here. But yeah, I mean, so I missed no doubt some important points. But I think, just to echo what Rachel said about Vera, I think, yes, we're seeing some very dubious certifications being dealt out. I think there's various conflicts of interest between the certifiers and who they're certifying. For example, Vera actually gets a commission on the credits that get issued. So I think there's lots. I think the kind of underpinnings of these various processes definitely warrant closer examination, as they did with the FSC and with the timber industry. I would also think that nature-based solutions is a big one. Nature-based solutions is, it's essentially the latest incarnation of RED. It sounds great. It's based on fairly outlandish claims about the mitigation potential of nature. And the kind of land that would be required to implement nature-based solutions at scale pose significant threats to the rights of local and indigenous communities potentially, and their food security. So I think there's a big piece of work on that. But maybe kind of jumping into the question of RED. It has been around for 15 years. It was, when it was first introduced in Bali, I think it was in 2007. It was posited as a silver bullet solution to tropical forest loss. It soon became apparent that it wasn't a silver bullet solution to tropical forest loss. Deforestation has increased over the past 15 years. That RED has been operational. There's issues around how people can gain baselines to increase their credits. We discussed the question of additionality. There's issues around permanence, in the sense that if someone claims a carbon credit for a saved tree 1 year and that tree gets knocked down, then what was the value of that actual carbon credit in the first place? The issues around leakage. If you have a carbon project and you manage to protect trees in one area, but then you just displace deforestation to another area, and so on and so forth. And of course, the impact on human rights. And I know that, and I'm sure that Francis will come back on this, that Art, Trees and Leaf is an attempt to address these kind of flaws in the RED architecture. And yeah, I think there is some progress, but I think the question is how the theory of this sort of translate to the realities on the ground. And no doubt Francis would want to come back on that. Francis,
go ahead.
Yeah, I see we only have a few minutes left before I've been going to Q&A, so this will be the short version. All is okay. The assertion is we've been doing RED for 15 years, and I would contest that, because the truth is, the large scale finance that was envisioned back in 2007 has never really materialized. I mean, the amount of money, from public sources for RED Plus has been, at best $1 billion a year or something, which is chump change to the economies of countries like Brazil or Indonesia. And the voluntary market, until very recently, was also, simmering along at a fairly low level. And many RED Plus projects actually folded for lack of market. So to say that, we've been doing it 15 years is not quite right. And one of the reasons that the public money that we did have moved so slowly, for example, in the World Bank's Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, is that we took years to elaborate the methodological framework and the rules to make sure that a lot of the concerns you just articulated were addressed. And I'm told informally that one of the reasons that the agreements under the FCPF took so long was that, it often took a long time to negotiate benefit sharing arrangements to make sure, there would be a fair allocation. So I think it's not quite fair to say that, oh, we've been doing this for 15 years and, it didn't work. The other thing I would say is that actually, even with the little bits of money invested in what so-called RED Plus readiness to work with forest countries to develop the building blocks that, the crediting could be built on, a lot has been achieved. I mean, it's quite remarkable how the forest monitoring systems in dozens of countries have been significantly improved. I mean, one of the things we celebrated this morning at the tree cover loss release was the fact that Indonesia, has now reduced deforestation 5 years in a row. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. Who would have predicted that, before 5 years ago? But one of the contributions to that success has been, enforcement and making permanent of a moratorium that was put, moratorium on new licenses for intact forests and peatlands that was put into place under the RED Plus agreement with Norway. So to say that it hasn't had any impact, I think is probably not correct. And finally, I would say that we do have a number of examples of how RED Plus discussions, whether in the context of the UNFCCC or in national policy arenas, has actually provided one of the first and most effective openings for Indigenous and local communities to have a seat at the table and voice their objectives. Now, is the job done? Absolutely not. But the fact of the Cancun safeguards and advances that have been made in individual countries, I don't think we should discount completely the impact that RED Plus has already had, even before the performance-based finance has begun to flow.
Okay, we both Joe and Rachel have raised their hands, so let's keep the responses a little bit brief because we have two big central questions that we have to get to in the remaining time. So Joe, go ahead, and then Rachel.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm slightly biased because our organization, we work across the tropics, but primarily in the Congo Basin. And yeah, I mean, we engage constructively with a lot of the RED processes in the sense that, you had to build enabling conditions for credits to flow, whether you believe in them or not. And we don't, to be be frank, but we believe in the enabling conditions. So how you can clarify things like land rights, how you can do things like the carbon accounting and the institution building. But what we found was that the different readiness requirements, particularly through the World Bank's FCPF program, will continually kick down the road. So it was always, okay, we're going to address the land rights issue another time, we're going to address the benefit sharing another time. The market forces are at play. And I know there's this renewed effort through Leaf, and I hope that it can address some of those those sort of fundamental issues that we've encountered thus far.
Rachel, go ahead.
Yeah, agreement with Joe, and then essentially just to say, like, I think it's dangerous to celebrate the creation of frameworks that are not able to be applied globally, for one, and are also not the actual solution to the actual problem. Like, the problem is, as Joe said, it's land rights. It's commodification. It's the fact that it's exploitative relationships, essentially, either locally or internationally. Like, this is the issue. This is why forests are getting cut down and why people are getting kicked off their lands. And carbon credits are not going to solve those issues unless you solve those relationships underpinning them as well.
Okay, actually, that's our next question. Is we want to talk about that, specifically FPIC. Briefly, just explain for our audience what that is. And recently Mongabay reported on, as you mentioned earlier, Rachel, the story in Saba where a 100-year carbon deal on 2 million hectares of land didn't include substantial input from local and indigenous populations. So what should journalists be looking for or paying attention to in stories like that? What are some other examples?
Yeah, I'm going to defer to my colleagues who would have probably want to talk more about those kinds of examples. All I would say is that those kinds of examples could not be validated or independently verified, under a high quality carbon standard. So, I think the issue is to make sure that we have high integrity standards and high integrity processes for validating them, so that any credits that were purported to emerge from those kinds of practices just never made it to the market. And that's what the ART tree standard is meant to do for jurisdictional scale crediting.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I would also question why that hasn't happened yet. If RED hasn't really been implemented for 15 years because it's taken so long to put the methodology and the framework in place, how are these deals still happening? Why is the market unregulated? Why is the UN not pushing immediately for its global regulation? These are questions I ask as a journalist. I mentioned before the displacement of indigenous peoples in Mexico. That is absolutely key. So one thing that people don't really know, because it's not always true, is that sometimes, right, for a forest to be credited, it means that the financial payment ensures its protection in some way. And often that means that if the land is already stewarded by indigenous peoples, then you cannot put that forest on the carbon credit market, because you're not actually paying for anything extra because they're already looking after that land. So there's an NGO, I'm going to forget the name of it now. So Savior International, I think they're doing a big campaign called Big Green Lie or something about this. That's not true everywhere. Sometimes indigenous peoples are taken into the decision-making process. Sometimes they are a stakeholder, sometimes they're ignored nonetheless. But what we are seeing around the world is the displacement of indigenous peoples from their ancestral land in order to put those forests on the carbon credit market. So that's one thing to absolutely look at. Vulnerable nations that are typically ignored as well by international media, like Southeast Asia, like especially the Pacific. The amount of stories right now of environmental corruption and abuses to do with the carbon credit market that are coming out of Papua New Guinea alone is phenomenal, because people typically just do not pay attention to this country. So I would advise anybody to go and have a look over there as well. Other examples. Well, I mean, I think I've given a few now.
I've got a few. unsurprisingly. I mean, listen, I think with the various net zero commitments that have been made, before and after COP26, it was fairly foreseeable that would unleash significant demand for forest carbon credits. But I have to say, post COP, what we've been seeing actually far outstrips what I was imagining. Essentially, what we're seeing in parts of the Congo Basin, but not just the Congo Basin, Peru, Sabah, various other examples, we're seeing essentially what is a green rush for forest land in the global south, where land is cheap, tenure is insecure. And just to give one example, and we're going to be publishing this tomorrow actually, there's an Indian company that signed a contract with the DRC Environment Ministry to secure carbon rights over a third of the territory of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And when it realized it didn't quite have the sort of legitimacy to do that, it's basically been marauding around the DR Congo trying to con communities out of their community forests and tie them into 100-year deals on absolutely terrible terms. So I think the reality in tropical forest countries where governance tends to be weak, not exclusively, is that what we're seeing is a scramble for land essentially, and I think it's really, really dangerous. And I that's the reality. Us and our local partners are firefighting on so many fronts. There's logging companies that are flipping their concessions illegally. There's Total has set up a plantation to offset its oil block in the Cuvée Central peatland, the largest carbon sink in the world. So this is a reality on the ground that we're facing, and I think what's going to happen is we're going to have some better initiatives, and some of them might be included in the leaf art trees kind of dynamic. But a lot of what we're going to be seeing is chaos essentially, and the underlying forces around forest governance, lack of rights, lack of governance, etc. Those are still there, and that's the reality on the ground. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Joe. My last question is to you all: is what claims? I guess this gets into more of gets into the question of permanence, but what claims can companies make based on carbon credits, and what claims versus what claims are actually being made in reality? I understand that this is a really huge question and we don't have a ton of time, so feel free to give me your best summation.
So right now it's a wild west out there. Companies can make whatever claim they want because there's really no agreed, set of claims. There are several initiatives that are trying to elaborate that guidance. One is called the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative that has out for consultation right now. In fact, some draft claims guidance for corporations that distinguishes, different kinds of claims that companies can make based on the purchase of forest carbon credits or carbon credits in general. I think an important distinction is the one that I made at the beginning of this webinar, and that is whether companies are trying to make claims based on purchases alone or claims that are integrated in the sense of claims based on purchases above and beyond meeting their science-based targets kind of obligations to decarbonize as quickly as possible. And I think that is a story to watch in terms of whether in the coming months and years, a new norm can be established and ultimately incorporated into national regulation about, false advertising that makes distinctions among these different kinds of claims so that that's not misleading to consumers. The challenge, of course, is it's hard to put all that nuance on the label of a candy bar. And so it's got to be, pretty radically simplified in a way that is both transparent, but that also, motivates companies in the right direction.
I'd like to build on what Francis said and zoom out a little bit and also say that it's very much worth investigating who's setting what standards and who's encouraging the use of what language and what that language actually means. So a great tip I would give to any journalist is to look at whether or not emissions and revenue are coupled whenever a company is reporting its net emissions. So there's all these very clever little accounting tools that can be used to make a company look very green in its bid to achieve net zero. Net zero doesn't mean that they're not polluting. It just means that maybe they have the financial capital to buy a bunch of carbon credits or whatever it is. So be very wary of green efficiency, essentially greenwashing. Look at how they've coupled emissions and whatever other mechanisms in their company, and then also look at the body that they are using to report their emissions and things like that. Great.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And Joe, we're just finishing up this last question. Before we get to our audience Q&As, can you just go ahead and elaborate what you were talking about earlier on permanence and what that means?
So the idea of permanence essentially rests on as I said previously, that if you make some emission savings 1 year, and then a credit enters the system, and then the following year a palm oil plantation is established on that land, but that credit still exists, it's in the system. Therefore, it has no actual emissions reduction saving. And there's various accounting mechanisms to try and avoid that happening. But that's the sort of general underlying principle of it. And it's why various different RED programs try to sort of create things like buffer zones, sort of buffer emissions to try and take into account these kinds of risks. But it's all based on counterfactuals and hypothetical scenarios.
Great. Well, folks, it's time to start getting into our audience Q&As. So I'm going to go ahead and open those up, and we're going to start first from Deborah. Question for Francis. In the United States, at least, natural solutions don't receive the Section 45Q tax credit like technological options like direct air capture. Do you know why, and can this be changed?
Unfortunately, I'm useless to you since I focus on tropical forest climate and carbon crediting. I don't really know the details of the U.S. System, but it's not surprising to me that often the sort of nature-based solutions are not privileged compared to technological solutions and all kinds of policies. And even that is a subset within the privileging of solutions targeted at fossil emissions rather than those that are related to nature. So I hope the incentives can be aligned, but unfortunately I can't answer you the specific question that you posed.
No worries. We'll move on to our second question from Grant Roseman. To address the issue of companies using carbon offsets to avoid necessary emissions reductions, should oil, coal, and gas companies be able to purchase offsets to achieve net zero? When to have any chance of staying within 1.5, society needs to rapidly halt the use of fossil fuel use. And secondly, to keep the focus on incentivizing emissions reductions, should there be an immediate cap on what % of residual emissions companies or governments can offset, such as 1% or 5%? Anyone can answer.
So go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead, Rachel.
I think this is really simple. I think in response to the first one, no. And in response to the second one, yes. Oil and gas companies should not be allowed to offset at all. And I think that just reveals how this mechanism could be used to continue business as usual to the great detriment of our planet. And I think having a cap on residual emissions is also equally a fantastic idea that would actually combat part of that problem.
So it's actually one thing I should have said in response to the previous question about claims is, an example of a claim is the marketing of carbon neutral gasoline, right? In Europe, in the UK. And, I think for many people, that's kind of an oxymoron, and kind of shows the marketing, the challenges related to claims related to the use of carbon credits to offset emissions. Because one could argue that a consumer at the petrol station could get the idea that, oh, well, if I buy more gasoline, I'm saving more trees, it's good for the climate to drive further, so we certainly need to worry about that. The problem with the oil and gas sector is that, among other problems, but the problem in this context is that unlike other sectors for which there are published and agreed decarbonization pathways to get to net zero, for other sectors like the electricity sector, there is no similar agreement for the oil and gas sector. So when you talk about, residual emissions, nobody knows what that ought to be. What does that curve look like? And so that's been sort of paralyzing, I think, in this universe to even think about what would be the percentages that the questioner, is referring to when you don't know what the sort of baseline is for a decarbonization trajectory. Now, hopefully that's something that people smarter than I am can figure out sooner rather than later. But capping the amount that a company can that can compensate for with carbon credits, it seems to me that only makes sense in a compliance market situation, which is probably the first best solution. But in a voluntary scenario, if we were agreed on what oil and gas companies should be doing to decarbonize as quickly as possible, I don't have any problem with them paying for the compensation for all of the emissions that are residual, as long as that residual is truly residual. And it's, sort of analogous to the way I think about the airline industry. I mean, unfortunately, we don't have the technologies now to fly around in airplanes and have zero carbon footprint. So I'm all in favor of pressing the airlines to reduce emissions through the technologies that we now have in terms of, lighter airplanes and less time flying around unnecessarily, and all of us flying less than we need to. But to the extent that there are residual emissions, by all means, finance compensating actions through purchase, for example, of forest carbon credits.
Rachel, go ahead. You had your hand raised.
I just wanted to quickly note that buying carbon credits is offsetting. It is not decarbonizing. And you cannot inherently decarbonize the fossil fuel industry. So yeah, I think it's kind of a moot point.
And I'll just add to that. I mean, I said, the whole kind of premise, recent support for nature-based solutions rests on the idea that nature can account for 1/3 of global climate mitigation potential by 2030. That's an often cited figure. And it's no surprise that the biggest supporters of those kinds of sums are the oil and gas industry. They have been behind this concept from a pretty early stage. And yeah, I mean, I just repeat the example of Total gaining this oil block in the Cuvette Central peatlands along the Congo River, probably the biggest natural carbon sink on Earth. And their plans to offset that with this 40,000 hectare tree plantation, essentially, which they're actually going to cut down for wood in 20 years anyway. So yeah, I think they need to be held to task.
Great. I want to keep moving on until we get to the rest of these questions. Are there areas that are flying under the radar in terms of carbon market reporting, or does basically everywhere need more eyes?
I could jump in on that. Everywhere definitely needs more eyes, but like the island nation states, definitely. The Pacific there are just not enough stories coming out of the Pacific, and they are extremely vulnerable, and they are getting exploited at an incredible rate. So Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, everywhere over in that part of the world, I would encourage people to go and have a look.
For me, I would just say again what I said earlier, that there are a lot of fancy new technologies and carbon crediting methodologies that are being put forward, that some of which are kind of dodgy. And I think those are currently flying under the radar and could use some more scrutiny from journalists.
And get some funding to travel to some very, very remote areas, because a lot of these things are happening far, far away from our gaze. So yeah, find some deep-pocketed sponsors and get out into the field and document this stuff, because there's a real information gap between how these projects are sold and what's actually happening on the ground in places like the Congo and so on and so forth.
Great, thank you, everyone. So this next question, which actually ties into a question I had meant to ask earlier, but where do you all research these topics? Where do you start? What are some of the tools that you use or resources that you use to dig deeper? Can you share those with our audience here?
Sources, I'm afraid, very old-fashioned. Most of the stories that I get come directly from the people on the ground. in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific. I've been fortunate enough to build up a network of sources there. So that I can't help. I mean, I would say look into companies that are carbon credit companies that are offshore, and then see where they're active, and go from there.
I'd say, I'd say in many of the countries that we work in, there are some fantastic civil society organisations and Indigenous peoples organisations that are willing to speak truth to power, and a lot of international sort of donor finance bypasses those, and they really are the people that can bring proper scrutiny to those kinds of projects, and that's where we get a lot of information from. They're the people that are going to change the dial on this.
And I'd just say that since this webinar is about, carbon crediting, there's a lot of information that's not in the public domain and non-transparent, but there's a lot that is. And all of the crediting standards, maintain registries of various kinds with lots of information on a project by project basis about where, credits are being issued. And so, for example, on the ART website, there you can actually click on the concept notes that different countries that are registered under the ART standard, have put forward their parameters. So there's a fair amount of information out there to start and identify where there may be some particular places where there are jurisdictions or projects to be investigated further.
Great, thanks. We have time for just a couple more questions. This next one, you sort of all were talking about this earlier, and I understand that we don't have a ton of time to discuss it, but Robert McClure says, I would like to continue on this discussion of whether the profit motive can be harnessed to do this job. Are we concluding that there is just too much corruption out there for this to ever work? And we never really got into whether there is an alternative. It seems like it's regulation, but has that been successful in the past?
Sorry, Francis. No.
No, I just really welcome this question because I think it is the key question that, we have tried to incentivize countries to protect forests through regulation for decades, and it really hasn't worked. And so the question is, can a financial proposition that changes the calculus for an elected leader of a province in Indonesia or a state in Brazil to actually weigh the alternative of protecting forests instead of leasing them out to timber concessions or oil palm concessions, or not enforcing the law against clearing for cattle ranching or whatever it is that's destroying the forests now. And as I said before, I don't think regulation and the market mechanisms are alternatives in this case. In the case of jurisdictional scale RED, they are actually complements that if you provide a financial reward for meeting this high standard, a standard like art trees, it is to me a reasonable proposition, as yet unproven, that governments would actually be incentivized not only to put into place the regulatory frameworks and enforce them, because most deforestation is illegal, let's be clear. So a lot of the time it's just enforcing laws that are already on the books, and having meaningful dialogues with the indigenous and local communities who have to be partners in that effort, since they are, as has been mentioned, among the best stewards of the forest, that could actually change the political economy of what's causing forest destruction now. And, is it guaranteed to work? No, but what we've been trying for the last several decades hasn't worked either. And especially if we really maintain these high standards, in my view, the alternative is no action, and we see where that's taking us. And 8 short years to get to zero, I think it's worth a try.
Yeah, I do not think that the market can solve this problem, especially not the free market, and especially not when it's being sort of run, even if it's regulated, but by private companies. I think a far better solution would be a carbon tax. And then you could perhaps use, the net zero methodology, but that would really encourage countries to not chop down their forests, because they would be getting taxed by, I don't know, by a global institution. Maybe that's something the UN could do. I think that would be far, far, far more effective than using a profit incentive.
And I think at COP26, the finalisation of Article 6 on the kind of international rulebook on carbon markets made the headlines, but there was an interesting thing that kind of slipped under the radar a little bit. Was it Article 6.8 on non-market based approaches to this kind of question? I think that that needs more thinking about. But there's I think it's an interesting stream of work there. But one of the things that we do as an organisation is we support local and indigenous communities to map their lands. So we equip them with smartphones, and then they have the maps, and then we support them to establish community forests and other sort of tenure arrangements to their traditional lands. And I think there has been a perceptible shift in international communities' recognition of the value of sort of indigenous and local community stewardship of forests. And I think there's a big bit of work to do in trying to ensure that money, and I think it was $1.7 billion that were kind of allocated to indigenous and local communities' rights, reaches those on the front lines. So how can we create the architecture where you fund the mapping work, you fund the titling work, you fund the kind of the livelihoods piece, because so little of that money actually reaches the ground. So that's a big job, and that's one of our key priorities as an organisation over the 12 months, is just to try and support that process.
Great. We've had a couple more questions come in here. So I want to be respectful of people's time here. Can you answer? Ghana is looking at going into carbon trading. What kind of stories should we be looking at there?
So actually, building on an area where Joe and I actually agree, I think implicitly, and that is that whatever you think about carbon markets as a solution, it's only one solution in a suite of tools that could be brought to bear, and no one of them is going to solve the problem. And the tool that Joe has emphasized rightly is the getting support directly to indigenous and local communities to represent their own interests and make their own choices about whether they want to participate in carbon markets. But Ghana is an interesting case where you've got an overlap between a national REDD+ program as well as a whole initiative to try to get deforestation out of the cocoa supply chain. And so, seeing how those initiatives relate to each other, as well as prior initiatives to try to improve legality in the timber sector. And all of these are important, addressing illegality, addressing public-private partnerships for particular commodities, carbon market finance, support to indigenous and local communities. And are these working in separate silos and at cross purposes, or are there mechanisms to bring them together so that they can be more effective as the sum of the parts rather than separate?
All right. In the interest of time, I'm just going to go ahead and get to this last follow-up question here from Barbara Fraser. She says, following up on Mr. McClure's question, so much of deforestation and degradation in the Amazon is related to organized crime, gold mining, illegal logging, drug crops, land trafficking. Is it reasonable to expect the market mechanisms to compete with organized crime and the related corruption?
I'm going to jump in here. And also, I do want to answer the Ghana question. I think that deals are struck between people. So look at whoever's in the ministry and look at whoever's in the companies, quite frankly. On this, my answer is just no. No, we cannot expect the market to be able to deal with this. It hasn't dealt with it in the logging industry, so why would this be any different?
I think for me, the answer to that one is kind of the same. It's like we can't expect the carbon market alone to overcome those kinds of problems, but in combination with cooperation and international law enforcement mechanisms, empowering local communities, a sort of all of the above strategy. I don't think we have the option of giving up hope, because the alternative is abject despair and abandoning these forests and all the people who do depend on them to an unacceptable situation and dooming the planet, frankly, to blowing way past the Paris goals. So I think we have no choice but, again, to use all the tools in the toolbox to bring to bear on those local situations. As the international community, we can only put a thumb on the scale. Ultimately, it's going to be determined by the domestic political economy, but certainly to the extent that these commodities are globally traded and that there are tools in terms of access to markets or law enforcement that we can help bring to bear, we have a moral obligation to do so, because the catastrophe that's unfolding on the ground is just totally unacceptable.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's the general carbon price over the past decade has been hovering around $5 a ton. That hasn't incentivized change in land use, and you sort of put that up against the amount of money that can be made from a palm oil concession, for example. It pales into compels into comparison. I know via the Leaf initiative that's been raised to $10 a ton. But again, I think that would struggle in comparison to some of the other illicit gains and legal gains that can be made by other users of forest. So that's an ongoing question.
All right, folks, we are quite a bit past time, so I'm going to have to go ahead and end it here. And I just wanted to say, on behalf of Mongabay, I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their expertise with us, and I also want to thank everyone here, the audience, for joining us. We really do hope that these live events, inform the work that you do and help give you a better understanding of the environmental topics that we and other outlets cover. When you registered for this webinar, you should have received a survey, so please let us know what you think so we can keep improving them and subsequent discussions that we have. And in case you want to reference this webinar in the future, again, it will be published to our YouTube channel, so just make sure you follow us there and subscribe, and we will also be publishing a link to this video on our blog at mongabay.org. And if you have any ideas that you'd like to pitch to us, you can do so at our opportunities page at mongabay.org. Just scroll down on that page and click on the one that says carbon offsets. And while there, sign up for our newsletter, which shares paid reporting opportunities plus job openings. So thank you all so much for helping make this webinar a success. Please follow us for future ones, which we'll be doing on things like illegal wildlife trafficking, oceans and fisheries, and a data journalism webinar as well. So you can get updates via our accounts on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and we're going to post announcements and updates in advance of each of those. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us, everybody, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike.